Munich, 1943. The confessional booth of St. Mary's Church stood in the shadows of the nave, a wooden sanctuary where sins were whispered and absolution granted. But on a cold November evening, something unprecedented was happening inside that sacred space. Father Heinrich Weber, a 47-year-old parish priest who had served this community for 8 years, sat motionless as Colonel Klaus Richter of the SS confessed to overseeing the execution of 273 civilians in a Polish village. The priest's hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what was hidden beneath his cassock, a small recording device, no larger than a cigarette case, capturing every word. This was not the first time Father Weber had violated the sacred seal of confession, and it would not be the last. What drove a man of God to commit what the Church considered an unforgivable sin? The answer lies in a secret operation that would challenge everything we think we know about faith, morality, and the cost of resistance during the darkest chapter of human history. The Munich that Father Weber knew before the war was a city of culture, beer gardens, and Sunday masses, filled with families who had worshipped in St. Mary's for generations. The church itself was a modest Gothic structure, built in 1789, with stained glass windows depicting the Stations of the Cross, and a pipe organ that had survived Napoleon's campaigns. Weber had been ordained in 1922, serving in various parishes across Bavaria, before settling in Munich, where he became known for his compassionate sermons and his willingness to hear confessions at any hour. He was a man who believed deeply in the transformative power of the sacrament of reconciliation, who saw the confessional not as a place of judgment, but as a hospital for souls. His parishioners trusted him completely, bringing him their marital troubles, their financial worries, their moments of weakness and doubt. He kept every secret, as his vows demanded. But that was before the brown shirts marched through the streets, before the synagogues burned, before the war turned his beloved city into a machinery of death. By 1943, Munich had transformed into something unrecognizable. The Nazi Party had established its headquarters just blocks from St. Mary's Church, and the city had become a nerve center for SS operations throughout southern Germany and occupied territories. The congregation had changed too. Many of the Jewish families who once attended services at the synagogue down the street had simply vanished, their homes now occupied by party officials and military personnel. Father Weber watched as neighbors who had once greeted each other warmly now whispered denunciations to the Gestapo. He heard confessions from men who worked at Dachau, the concentration camp just 10 miles north of the city, men who sought absolution for things they described in clinical detached language. At first he had maintained his sacred duty, offering penance and prayers, believing that God's mercy extended even to those who committed terrible acts. But as the confessions grew darker, as the details became more horrific, something inside him began to break. How could he grant forgiveness to men who showed no true contrition, who returned week after week to confess the same atrocities, treating the sacrament like a spiritual laundry service? The breaking point came in September of 1943, when a high-ranking SS officer confessed to personally supervising the liquidation of an orphanage in Warsaw. 342 children, the officer said, his voice steady and emotionless. Father Weber sat frozen on the other side of the wooden screen, his mind unable to process what he was hearing. The officer did not sound remorseful. He sounded tired, asking for prayers to help him sleep better. When Weber asked if the man felt genuine sorrow for his actions, the officer paused, then said he was simply following orders and fulfilling his duty to the fatherland. That night, Father Weber did not sleep. He paced the empty church, his footsteps echoing in the darkness, grappling with an impossible question. What good was the seal of confession if it protected monsters? What kind of God would demand silence in the face of such evil? By dawn, he had made a decision that would condemn his immortal soul, or perhaps save it. He would break his sacred vows. He would become a spy. The transformation from priest to intelligence operative did not happen overnight, and it did not happen alone. Father Weber made contact with a man known only as Thomas, a supposed wine merchant who operated out of a shop near the English Garden. Thomas was, in reality, a British intelligence agent who had been operating in Munich since 1941, part of a network gathering information on Nazi military operations. Their first meeting was cautious, filled with coded language and unspoken tension. Weber explained what he had access to: the confessions of SS officers, Wehrmacht commanders, party officials who treated the confessional booth as a place to unburden themselves of operational stress. Thomas immediately understood the value. These men, in their moments of spiritual vulnerability, revealed troop movements, upcoming operations, the locations of weapons facilities, and the brutal realities of the final solution. But Thomas also understood the cost. He looked at the priest with something between admiration and pity, knowing that what Weber was proposing would destroy him spiritually, regardless of the outcome. Weber accepted a small recording device, a marvel of wartime technology, that could capture 30 minutes of conversation on a wire spool. The plan was simple and blasphemous: hide the device in the confessional, record the confessions of Nazi officers, and pass the recordings to Thomas, who would transmit the intelligence to London. For 3 months, Father Weber lived 2 lives. By day, he was the trusted parish priest, celebrating Mass, visiting the sick, maintaining the facade of normalcy in a world gone mad. By night, he was a traitor to his cloth and a hero to the Allied cause, though he never allowed himself to think in such terms. He would hide the recording device in a hollowed-out prayer book, activate it just before confession hours, and capture the voices of men who believed their sins would die in that booth. He learned which officers attended confession regularly, which ones spoke freely, which ones provided the most valuable intelligence. Colonel Richter became his most reliable source, a meticulous man who confessed every week, detailing operations with the precision of a military report. Weber would listen, murmur the ritual words of absolution, assign penance he knew would never be completed, and then remove the wire spool, hiding it in the lining of his cassock. The handoff to Thomas always happened in the same place, the wine shop, where Weber would purchase a bottle of communion wine and slip the spool into Thomas's hand with a handshake. The intelligence was gold. London learned of SS operations weeks before they happened, of troop concentrations, of the locations of ammunition depots, and with each passing week, Father Heinrich Weber felt his soul grow heavier, crushed under the weight of what he had become. The system worked with terrifying efficiency for those first 3 months, but Father Weber knew it could not last forever. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere in Munich, and the city had become a paranoid labyrinth where trust was a luxury no one could afford. Every conversation was potentially monitored, every friendship suspect, every act of kindness viewed through the lens of possible sedition. Weber had seen neighbors disappear for far less than what he was doing. A careless word about food shortages, a joke about the Führer overheard by the wrong person, a failure to give the Hitler salute with sufficient enthusiasm. These minor infractions led to midnight arrests, to interrogations in the basement of Gestapo headquarters on Brina Street, to destinations from which people rarely returned. And yet, despite the ever-present danger, Weber continued his secret mission, driven by something deeper than fear or even patriotism. He was driven by the faces he could not forget: the children from Warsaw, the civilians from Poland, the endless procession of victims whose deaths were confessed to him in clinical detail, by men seeking spiritual comfort they did not deserve. The first sign of danger came in late December of 1943, just days before Christmas. Father Weber was preparing for midnight mass when 2 Gestapo officers entered St. Mary's Church, their long leather coats dripping with winter rain. They did not come for confession or prayer. They came with questions about a parishioner, a woman named Margaret Schultz, who had been arrested for listening to BBC radio broadcasts. Did Father Weber know her? Had she confessed any seditious thoughts? The priest kept his voice steady, explaining that he could not discuss anything said in confession, a position the officers accepted with visible irritation but legal acknowledgement. Before they left, the older officer, a man with cold grey eyes and a dueling scar across his left cheek, paused at the door and looked back at the confessional booth. He studied it for a long moment, and Weber felt his blood turn to ice. The officer said nothing, simply turned and walked out into the rain. But the message was clear. They were watching, they were suspicious, and the net was tightening. That night, Weber considered stopping the operation entirely, removing the recording device and returning to being simply a priest. But then he remembered Colonel Richter's most recent confession, detailing plans for a new round of deportations from Munich itself, scheduled for early January. Hundreds of people who still remained in hiding, families who had managed to avoid the earlier sweeps. Weber could not stop, not yet. January of 1944 brought the coldest winter Munich had experienced in decades. The city was covered in snow and ice, and the war was turning against Germany, though few dared speak of it openly. The defeat at Stalingrad the previous year had shaken the confidence of even the most fervent believers in final victory, and now the Allies were advancing through Italy, while the Eastern Front consumed men and material at an unsustainable rate. But in Munich, the machinery of the Holocaust continued without pause, perhaps even accelerating as the Nazi leadership sought to complete their genocidal mission before the inevitable collapse. Father Weber's recordings captured this desperation, this frantic rush to finish what they had started. SS officers confessed to working longer hours, to processing more transports, to the burning of documents that might incriminate them when the Allies arrived. The intelligence Weber provided became even more valuable, helping Allied bombers target the rail lines used for deportations, helping resistance networks warn families scheduled for arrest, saving lives in ways Weber would never know about. But the priest himself was deteriorating. He had lost nearly 20 pounds. His hands shook constantly, and he could no longer sleep without nightmares. The act of hearing these confessions, of granting absolution to murderers, of maintaining the pretense of spiritual guidance while secretly recording every word, was destroying him from the inside. The crisis Weber had been dreading arrived on a grey February morning when Colonel Richter entered the confessional booth and did not begin with the traditional formula. Instead, there was silence, a long and terrible silence that stretched until Weber's heart was pounding so loudly he was certain Richter could hear it through the wooden screen. Then Richter spoke, but not to confess. He spoke about security, about how the Reich Security Main Office had become concerned about intelligence leaks in Munich, about how certain information was reaching the Allies with suspicious accuracy. Richter mentioned that they were investigating all possible sources, including churches, including priests, including the sanctity of the confessional itself. He said these things slowly, carefully, and Weber realized with horrifying clarity that this was not a confession at all. This was a test, perhaps even a threat. Richter knew something, or suspected something, and he was giving Weber a chance to reveal himself through nervousness or panic. The priest forced himself to breathe normally, to respond with the practiced calm of a man who had heard thousands of confessions, asking gently if Richter had sins to confess today. There was another pause, and then Richter began speaking again, this time in the formal cadence of confession, detailing a raid on a resistance cell that had killed 17 people. But Weber knew the game had changed. The hunter had become aware of being hunted. That evening, Father Weber met with Thomas for what both men understood might be their final exchange. The wine shop was dark, except for a single lamp, and Thomas's usually composed face showed genuine concern. The intelligence services in London had become aware of increased Gestapo activity around St. Mary's Church, and they were ordering Weber to cease operations immediately and prepare for possible extraction. But extraction meant leaving Germany, leaving his parish, abandoning the mission that had given terrible purpose to his breaking of sacred vows. Weber refused. He had 3 more wire spools ready for transmission, containing information about a major SS operation planned for March, something involving the deportation of the remaining Jewish population from Bavaria and Austria. This intelligence could save thousands of lives, and he would not leave until it was safely in Allied hands. Thomas argued, pleaded, even threatened, but Weber was immovable. He was a priest who had already damned himself by violating the seal of confession. He would not compound that damnation by abandoning his mission when it mattered most. The two men parted in tension and mutual respect, both knowing that the end was coming one way or another. Father Heinrich Weber walked back through the frozen streets of Munich to St. Mary's Church, where the confessional booth waited in the shadows, along with the recording device that had become both his weapon and his curse. The March operation that Colonel Richter had confessed about was called Action Reinhard Final Phase, a systematic sweep designed to empty every remaining ghetto, hiding place and safe house across southern Germany and Austria. The intelligence Weber had captured was staggering in its detail. Specific addresses in Munich, where families were hiding in attics and cellars, the names of sympathizers who had provided false papers, the dates and times when SS units would conduct raids in coordinated strikes across 6 cities simultaneously. Richter had confessed all of this with the mechanical precision of a man reciting a grocery list, seeking absolution not for the act itself, but for the stress it caused him, for the sleepless nights worrying about meeting quotas set by Berlin. Weber had listened with the recording device hidden inside a hollowed Bible, his face a mask of pastoral concern, while his soul screamed in anguish. This single confession contained enough information to potentially save thousands of lives, but it also represented the most dangerous intelligence Weber had ever captured. If the Gestapo discovered that this specific operational plan had been leaked, they would know the source could only be someone with access to the highest levels of SS leadership. The investigation would be ruthless and thorough, and it would inevitably lead to St. Mary's Church. Weber knew he was running out of time, but he also understood that getting this intelligence to Thomas and ultimately to London was worth any risk. The challenge was the increased Gestapo presence around the church. Since Richter's veiled warning in February, Weber had noticed surveillance becoming more obvious, almost theatrical in its visibility. Black sedans parked across the street for hours, the same faces appearing repeatedly in the congregation during Mass, strangers who sat in the back pews and watched him with undisguised interest. They were creating pressure, waiting for him to make a mistake, to reveal himself through panic or suspicious behavior. The normal handoff protocol at the wine shop was no longer safe. Thomas had sent word through a complicated series of dead drops that they needed a new meeting location, something unexpected and public enough to provide cover. They settled on the crowded Viktualienmarkt, Munich's central food market, where hundreds of people gathered daily to purchase whatever meager rations were available in the 4th year of war. Weber would carry the wire spools hidden in a basket of vegetables, and Thomas would brush past him in the crowd, making the exchange in plain sight while surrounded by housewives, black marketeers, and inevitably Gestapo informants. The morning of the exchange, March 15, 1944, arrived with unseasonable warmth that melted the lingering snow and turned Munich's streets into rivers of grey slush. Father Weber celebrated morning mass with special intensity, knowing it might be his last. He spoke to his small congregation about sacrifice, about the cost of standing against evil, about how faith sometimes demanded actions that seemed to contradict the very principles it was meant to uphold. The dozen elderly parishioners who attended weekday mass nodded along, assuming he was speaking abstractly about martyrs and saints from centuries past, unaware that their priest was delivering his own confession disguised as a homily. After Mass, Weber changed from his ceremonial vestments into a simple black suit and overcoat, wanting to blend into the crowd at the market. He placed the 3 wire spools into a basket, covering them with turnips and potatoes purchased the previous day. The spools were small, each no larger than a pocket watch, but they felt impossibly heavy as he walked through the streets toward Viktualienmarkt. Every person he passed seemed suspicious. Every glance felt like accusation. Every sound made him flinch. This was not courage. This was terror barely controlled through force of will and desperate prayer. Viktualienmarkt was chaos incarnate, a seething mass of humanity fighting over scraps in a city slowly starving under Allied blockades and the demands of total war. The market stalls that once overflowed with Bavarian abundance now offered wilted vegetables, ersatz coffee made from acorns, bread that was more sawdust than flour, and meat of questionable origin sold at extortionate prices. Weber pushed through the crowd, clutching his basket, searching for Thomas among the hundreds of faces. He found him near a stall selling dried fish, dressed as a laborer in worn clothes and a flat cap pulled low over his eyes. The plan was simple. Weber would stop to examine the fish. Thomas would jostle past him as if by accident, and in that moment of contact the spools would transfer from Weber's basket to Thomas's coat pocket. But as Weber approached, He noticed something that made his stomach drop. 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a column, stood the Gestapo officer with the dueling scar, the same man who had studied the confessional booth in December. He was watching the crowd with predatory focus, and Weber realized with sickening certainty that this was a trap. They knew about the meeting. They had been waiting for exactly this moment. Weber had perhaps 10 seconds to decide: abort the mission and save himself, or complete the handoff knowing it would likely lead to his arrest and execution. Father Heinrich Weber did not hesitate. He walked directly to the fish stall, made a show of examining the dried herring, and felt Thomas brush past him with practiced efficiency. The weight in his basket disappeared as the spools transferred to Thomas's pocket, and for one brief moment, Weber felt overwhelming relief. The intelligence was safe. The mission was complete. Then he heard the shout, sharp and commanding, cutting through the market noise. The Gestapo officer with the scar was pointing directly at Thomas, and 3 more officers emerged from the crowd, moving with coordinated precision toward the British agent. Thomas ran, shoving through the panicked crowd as vendors scattered and shoppers screamed. Weber stood frozen, watching as the chase unfolded, knowing he should run in the opposite direction but unable to move. Then Thomas did something unexpected and heroic. As the Gestapo closed in, he pulled the wire spools from his pocket and threw them high into the air, scattering them into the crowd where they landed among overturned vegetable carts and trampled produce. The officers lunged for the spools, creating confusion and precious seconds of delay. Thomas used that moment to disappear into an alley, and though Weber heard gunshots echo off the buildings, he never saw whether the British agent escaped. What he did see with absolute clarity was the Gestapo officer with the scar turning slowly to look directly at him, recognition and triumph spreading across the man's scarred face. Father Heinrich Weber's war was over, and his trial was about to begin. The arrest came not in the chaos of the market, but 12 hours later, in the quiet darkness of St. Mary's Church. Father Weber had returned to the church after the failed handoff, his mind racing through possibilities and prayers, knowing that flight was pointless and that facing the consequences was the only path left to him. He spent those final hours of freedom in the sanctuary, kneeling before the altar, where he had celebrated thousands of masses, asking God for forgiveness, not for betraying the seal of confession, but for not doing it sooner, for the lives he might have saved if he had started his mission years earlier. When the Gestapo arrived at 2 in the morning, Weber was still kneeling, and he did not resist as they pulled him to his feet and placed him in handcuffs. The officer with the dueling scar, who identified himself as Kriminalkommissar Heinrich Gruber, smiled with cold satisfaction, as he informed Weber that he was being charged with treason, espionage, and violations of the Reich Security Act. As they led him out of the church, Weber looked back one final time at the confessional booth that had been his battlefield, wondering if God would judge him more harshly for the vows he broke or for the evil he had tried to stop. The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid, and Father Heinrich Weber disappeared into the basement cells of Gestapo headquarters on Brienner Street. The interrogation began immediately and continued for 6 days without pause. A calculated assault on Weber's physical endurance and mental resolve, designed to extract not just confession, but the complete destruction of any Allied intelligence network operating in Munich. Criminal Commissar Gruber was a professional, educated at university before joining the security services, and he approached interrogation as a scientist approaches an experiment, methodically, patiently, with careful attention to variables and results. He did not begin with torture, but with conversation, sitting across from Weber in a surprisingly comfortable room, offering coffee and cigarettes, speaking in reasonable tones about the futility of resistance and the mercy available to those who cooperated fully. Weber said nothing, invoking his right as a Catholic priest to remain silent on matters of confession, a legal protection that technically still existed even in Nazi Germany. Gruber smiled at this, acknowledging the cleverness of the defense, before explaining that the Reich had evidence far beyond anything said in the confessional. They had recovered 2 of the 3 wire spools from the market, and technicians were currently analyzing the recordings. They had testimony from informants who had seen Weber meeting with Thomas at the wine shop. They had surveillance photographs showing the priest carrying suspicious packages. The evidence was overwhelming, Gruber explained, and cooperation was Weber's only chance to avoid the most severe consequences. When persuasion failed, the interrogation shifted to harsher methods, though Gruber maintained his professional demeanor throughout. Weber was deprived of sleep, subjected to standing stress positions for hours, beaten with calculated precision that left no permanent marks but caused extraordinary pain. Between sessions, Gruber would return with new revelations designed to break Weber's spirit. Thomas had been captured trying to cross into Switzerland and had been executed by firing squad. The entire British intelligence network in Bavaria had been rolled up based on information found in Thomas's apartment. 63 people had been arrested in connection with the spy ring, including the owner of the wine shop and several members of Weber's own parish. Some of this was true, some was fabrication, but Weber had no way to distinguish between fact and psychological warfare. What broke him finally was not the physical torture, but the moral torture. Gruber's insistence that Weber's actions had accomplished nothing, that the intelligence had never reached London, that the wire spools contained only fragments of useless conversation, and that every person arrested because of Weber's amateur espionage operation had died for absolutely nothing. The priest wept then, not from pain but from the possibility that his betrayal of his sacred vows had been meaningless, that he had damned himself for no purpose whatsoever. On the seventh day, Weber was transferred from the interrogation cells to a regular holding cell, a sign that the Gestapo had extracted everything they needed or had concluded he had nothing more to give. The cell was small and cold, shared with 3 other prisoners who did not speak and avoided eye contact. Men who had learned that conversation in Gestapo custody was dangerous. Weber spent his time in prayer, though the words felt hollow, echoing in the empty space where his faith had once resided. He prayed for the families whose hiding places he had exposed through his captured recordings, for Thomas, who might or might not be dead, for the parishioners who had trusted him and were now suffering because of their association with a traitor priest. He prayed for Colonel Richter and the other SS officers whose confessions he had recorded, asking God to grant them genuine repentance even as he struggled to believe such redemption was possible. And he prayed for himself, asking not for deliverance from his fate, but for the strength to face it with dignity, and the wisdom to understand whether his actions had been righteous resistance or sinful pride disguised as heroism. The answer never came, and after 3 weeks in the cell, Weber was informed that his trial would begin the following Monday. The trial was held not in a regular court, but in the People's Court, a special tribunal established by the Nazis to handle cases of treason and political crimes. The proceedings were a formality, a theatrical performance designed to demonstrate the Reich's power and the futility of resistance. Weber was assigned a defense attorney who met with him for exactly 15 minutes before the trial and advised him to plead guilty and beg for mercy. The prosecutor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of a librarian, presented the evidence with meticulous detail. The wire spools with their damning recordings of SS confessions, testimony from Kriminalkommissar Gruber about Weber's capture, statements from parishioners who had unknowingly provided cover for his espionage activities. Weber was allowed to speak in his own defense, and he chose his words carefully, explaining that he had acted not against Germany, but against evil, that his loyalty was first to God and to the fundamental commandment against murder, and that history would judge harshly those who remained silent while atrocities were committed in their midst. The judges, 3 men in red robes who looked bored by the entire proceeding, deliberated for less than 20 minutes before returning with the verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by guillotine, to be carried out at Stadelheim prison within 30 days. Father Heinrich Weber heard the words without emotion, feeling only a profound exhaustion and a strange sense of relief that the waiting was finally over. Stadelheim prison in Munich was where the Reich sent those it had condemned to die, a massive fortress of grey stone that had witnessed thousands of executions since the Nazis came to power. Weber was transported there in chains, processed with bureaucratic efficiency, and placed in a cell designated for those awaiting execution. The cell was surprisingly clean, with a narrow bed, a small table, and a barred window that looked out onto the prison courtyard where the guillotine stood under a wooden shelter. The condemned were allowed certain privileges in their final days. They could write letters, receive visits from family, and meet with clergy for spiritual preparation. The irony was not lost on Weber that he, a priest who had spent decades preparing others for death, now needed someone to prepare him. The prison chaplain who came to his cell was Father Otto Brenner, an elderly Jesuit who had known Weber years earlier when they both taught at a seminary in Regensburg. Brenner's face showed no judgment, only deep sadness as he sat across from Weber and asked the question that hung between them like a sword. Did Weber wish to make his final confession? The younger priest laughed bitterly at this, asking how he could possibly confess when his greatest sin had been the breaking of confession itself, a violation so fundamental that it seemed to invalidate the entire sacramental system. Brenner listened patiently, then spoke words that Weber had not expected to hear, that God's mercy was infinite, that the seal of confession existed to protect penitents, not to shield murderers, and that sometimes the greater sin was silence in the face of evil that demanded witness. The two priests spent hours in theological debate, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Was the seal of confession absolute under all circumstances, or were there moral imperatives that transcended even sacred vows? Could betraying one sacrament in service of a higher moral law be considered righteous, or was it simply sin rationalized through desperation? Brenner offered no definitive answers, but he did offer something more valuable: the reminder that God judged hearts and intentions, not merely actions, and that Weber's struggle with his choices was itself evidence of genuine moral conscience rather than mere expedience. When Weber finally made his confession, it was not the cataloguing of specific sins, but a raw outpouring of doubt, fear, and anguish about whether his entire mission had been an act of faith or of faithlessness. Brenner granted absolution with tears streaming down his weathered face, and for the first time since his arrest, Weber felt a small measure of peace. It was not the peace of certainty, but the peace of acceptance, the understanding that he would die, not knowing whether he had saved lives or merely destroyed his own soul in a futile gesture of resistance. That uncertainty, Brenner suggested, was perhaps the truest test of faith: to act in the absence of divine assurance, to choose what seemed right even when the outcome remained hidden. In the days before his execution, Weber learned fragments of information that filtered through the prison via sympathetic guards and whispered conversations with other condemned prisoners. The intelligence he had gathered had not been entirely lost. While 2 of the wire spools were recovered by the Gestapo, the third had been found by a market vendor who, not understanding its significance, had sold it to a black marketeer who eventually passed it to someone connected to the resistance, who managed to get it into Allied hands through routes that remained mysterious and miraculous. That single spool, containing Colonel Richter's detailed confession about Action Reinhard Final Phase, had reached British intelligence in London 3 days before the operation was scheduled to begin. The Allies could not stop the entire operation, but they had been able to warn certain resistance networks, evacuate some hiding places, and arrange for several dozen families to be smuggled out of Munich before the SS raids began. The number of lives saved was impossible to calculate, but it was not zero. This knowledge gave Weber no satisfaction, only a complicated grief. Lives had been saved, but lives had also been lost. The parishioners arrested in the Gestapo sweep, Thomas, who may or may not have died in his escape attempt, the countless others caught in the machinery of investigation and reprisal. The moral calculus was impossible, an equation with too many variables and no clear solution. On his final night, Weber requested permission to celebrate one last Mass in his cell, a request that was surprisingly granted. Father Brenner brought the necessary elements: bread that would become body, wine that would become blood, the ancient words that transformed ordinary matter into sacred mystery. The 2 priests celebrated Mass together in the cramped cell, their voices barely above a whisper, performing a ritual that had been repeated for nearly 2,000 years in catacombs and palaces, in grand cathedrals and hidden rooms. When Weber spoke the words of consecration, he felt the weight of every Mass he had ever celebrated, every confession he had ever heard, every soul he had tried to shepherd toward grace. He thought of the parishioners at St. Mary's Church, who would wake tomorrow to find their priest gone, executed as a traitor without ever knowing the full truth of what he had done or why. He thought of Colonel Richter and the other SS officers whose sins he had recorded, wondering if any of them would eventually find genuine repentance or if they would continue their work of death until the inevitable collapse of the Reich. He thought of the children from the Warsaw orphanage, the civilians from the Polish villages, the thousands upon thousands whose deaths had been confessed to him in that wooden booth, and he hoped that somewhere in the mystery of divine justice they had found peace that had been denied them in life. The execution was scheduled for dawn on April 23, 1944. Weber was awakened at 4 in the morning, given a final meal he could not eat, and allowed to spend an hour in prayer with Father Brenner. At 5:30, the guards came for him, and he walked through the prison corridors with surprising calm, his hands unbound, his steps steady. The courtyard was cold and dark except for searchlights illuminating the guillotine, a machine of death that promised efficiency, if not mercy. A small group of witnesses had assembled, prison officials, a prosecutor from the People's Court, and Criminal Commissar Gruber, who had come to see the conclusion of his investigation. Weber was offered a blindfold, but refused it, wanting to face his death with open eyes. As they positioned him on the platform, he spoke his final words, not a defiant proclamation or a plea for forgiveness, but a simple prayer, that God would judge him not by the vows he had broken, but by the lives he had tried to save, and that the children whose deaths he could not prevent would be waiting for him on the other side of darkness. The blade fell at 5:51 in the morning, and Father Heinrich Weber died as he had lived in those final months, torn between the demands of his faith and the imperatives of his conscience, hoping that God would understand the choice he had made. The official record of Father Heinrich Weber's execution was filed in the Reich Security Main Office archives with bureaucratic precision. One Catholic priest, age 47, executed for treason and espionage against the German state. His personal effects were catalogued and stored, his death certificate was issued to the diocese, and St. Mary's Church was assigned a new priest within a week, a younger man who had been vetted by the Gestapo and could be trusted not to harbor seditious sympathies. The parishioners were told that Father Weber had been involved in criminal activities against the Reich, the details of which could not be disclosed for security reasons, and they were warned that expressing sympathy for traitors could result in their own arrest. Most accepted this explanation in silence, understanding that questions were dangerous in Munich in 1944. A few whispered among themselves, remembering the gentle priest who had baptized their children and buried their parents, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the crimes he had allegedly committed. But memory was a dangerous luxury in the Third Reich, and within months even these quiet remembrances faded into cautious forgetting. Father Heinrich Weber was erased from the official history of Munich, his name struck from parish records, his photographs removed from the church archives, as though he had never existed at all. But some stories refuse to die even when those who lived them have been silenced. In the months following Weber's execution, strange things began happening in Munich's intelligence community. British bombers seemed to have uncanny knowledge of where SS units were concentrated, arriving just hours after troops had assembled for operations. Resistance networks received warnings about Gestapo raids with impossible accuracy, allowing them to evacuate safe houses minutes before officers arrived. Allied intelligence demonstrated detailed knowledge of Nazi operations in Bavaria that should have been impossible to obtain after the supposed destruction of the British spy network. Criminal Commissar Gruber grew increasingly paranoid, launching investigation after investigation to find the source of the leaks, never understanding that the intelligence did not come from a current source, but from the past, from the wire spools that Weber had created during his months of secret recording. The third spool, the one that had escaped Gestapo capture, had contained far more than just information about Action Reinhard Final Phase. It contained dozens of confessions from multiple SS officers, a comprehensive map of Nazi operations in southern Germany, details about command structures, supply lines, weapons depots, and the locations of concentration camps and killing sites. This intelligence continued to bear fruit long after Weber's death, saving lives and disrupting operations in ways the priest would never know about. Among the Allied intelligence officers who analyzed Weber's recordings was a young American lieutenant named Robert Mitchell, assigned to the Office of Strategic Services Unit focused on German resistance movements. Mitchell had studied theology before the war and understood immediately what Weber had sacrificed to create these recordings. He wrote a detailed report, arguing that Weber should be recognized as one of the most valuable intelligence assets the Allies had in southern Germany, recommending him for posthumous honors and suggesting that his story be preserved for future historians. The report was filed, classified, and forgotten in the chaos of the war's final year. Mitchell himself survived the war, returned to America, and eventually became a professor of European history at Columbia University. For 40 years, he kept silent about the priest who had recorded confessions, bound by classification rules and the general secrecy that surrounded wartime intelligence operations. But he never forgot Weber, and in his lectures on the moral complexities of resistance during the Holocaust, he would sometimes speak hypothetically about the ethical dilemmas faced by clergy in Nazi Germany, asking his students what they would have done if faced with knowledge of atrocities gained through sacred confidence. He never revealed that he was speaking not in abstract, but from first-hand knowledge of a real man who had chosen conscience over canon law and paid for that choice with his life. The fate of Colonel Klaus Richter, the SS officer whose confessions had provided so much valuable intelligence, was both justice and irony. Richter survived the war, escaping Munich as Allied forces approached in April of 1945. He managed to avoid capture during the chaotic final weeks of the Reich's collapse, destroying his SS uniform and papers, assuming a false identity as a minor Wehrmacht logistics officer. He lived in hiding for 3 years, working as a farm laborer in rural Austria, believing he had escaped accountability for his crimes. But in 1948, he was recognized by a survivor of one of the Polish villages he had helped liquidate, a woman who had lost her entire family in the massacre Richter had confessed to Father Weber. She reported him to American occupation authorities, who arrested him and turned him over to Polish war crimes investigators. During his trial in Warsaw, prosecutors presented evidence that included testimony from survivors, documentation from captured SS records, and one additional piece of evidence that Richter could not explain: detailed knowledge of his operations that could only have come from someone with access to his private thoughts and words. He was convicted on multiple counts of crimes against humanity and hanged in 1949. He died confused and angry, never knowing that his own confessions, spoken in what he believed was the inviolable sanctuary of the confessional booth, had contributed to his eventual capture and execution. St. Mary's Church in Munich survived the war, though barely. In July of 1944, just 3 months after Weber's execution, Allied bombers targeted the industrial districts surrounding the church, and incendiary bombs set much of the neighborhood ablaze. The church itself was damaged, but not destroyed, its roof partially collapsed and its stained glass windows shattered by the concussive force of nearby explosions. The confessional booth where Weber had hidden his recording device was destroyed in the fire, reduced to charred wood and ash, as though God or history had decided to erase the physical evidence of what had happened there. After the war, the church was rebuilt by the surviving parishioners, who raised funds through donations and volunteer labor to restore their place of worship. The new confessional booth was constructed in a different location, made from clean pine instead of dark oak, with no hidden compartments or secret purposes. The priest who oversaw the reconstruction, Father Johannes Hoffmann, had served as an army chaplain during the war and knew something of the moral compromises that conflict demanded. When workers asked him about the previous confessional and whether it should be rebuilt in its original location, he said no, explaining that some places carried memories too heavy to resurrect. He never elaborated on what he meant, and the workers assumed he was speaking generally about the war. The new confessional was blessed and opened for use in 1947, and the parishioners of St. Mary's Church returned to the ancient rhythm of sin, confession, and absolution, never knowing that their quiet church had once been the site of one of the most daring intelligence operations in Munich. The true scope of Father Weber's intelligence operation remained hidden for decades, buried in classified archives on both sides of the Atlantic. The British Secret Intelligence Service files on Munich operations during the war were sealed under the Official Secrets Act and would not be declassified until 1995, 50 years after the end of the war. The American OSS records were similarly restricted, transferred to the Central Intelligence Agency upon its creation in 1947, and locked away in a vault at Langley headquarters, where they gathered dust alongside thousands of other wartime operations. The few people who knew the full story were bound by secrecy oaths, and most took that knowledge to their graves. Thomas, the British agent who had been Weber's primary contact, did not die in his escape from the Viktualienmarkt, as the Gestapo had claimed. He had been wounded in the chase, shot twice in the shoulder and leg, but he managed to reach a safe house operated by anti-Nazi Germans, who hid him for 6 weeks while he recovered. He was eventually smuggled into Switzerland in May of 1944, crossing the border hidden in a truck carrying medical supplies. He spent the rest of the war debriefing intelligence officers about his Munich network, providing details about Weber's operation and arguing passionately that the priest deserved recognition as a hero of the resistance. His recommendations were noted but not acted upon, filed away with the understanding that publicizing a priest who had violated the seal of confession would create diplomatic complications with the Vatican and the Catholic Church. After the war ended, Thomas returned to civilian life in England, resuming his actual profession as a wine merchant in London, a career that had provided perfect cover for his intelligence work. He never spoke publicly about his wartime activities, but in private he was haunted by the memory of Father Weber, the middle-aged priest who had risked and ultimately sacrificed everything to stop the machinery of genocide. In 1962, Thomas was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and knowing he had only months to live, he decided to violate his secrecy oath one final time. He wrote a detailed memoir of his Munich operations, focusing particularly on Weber's courage and the moral complexity of what the priest had done. He sent copies to the British government, to the Catholic Church, and to several historians he trusted, along with a letter explaining that some stories were too important to remain secret forever, that the dead deserved to be remembered not as statistics, but as human beings who made impossible choices in impossible times. The memoir created quiet controversy in intelligence circles, but it was ultimately suppressed by government pressure and Vatican concerns about the implications of celebrating a priest who had broken confession. Only a handful of copies survived, and Thomas died in January of 1963, without seeing his friend's story reach the public. The breakthrough that would eventually bring Weber's story to light came from an unexpected source: the opening of Soviet archives after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Among the millions of documents seized by the Red Army when they captured Berlin in 1945 were Gestapo files from Munich, including the complete records of Weber's arrest, interrogation, and trial. These files contained details that the British and American archives had omitted, including testimony from captured Gestapo officers about the extent of the intelligence damage Weber had caused. A young German historian named Claudia Brenner, granddaughter of Father Otto Brenner, who had given Weber his final confession, discovered these documents while researching Catholic resistance to the Nazis. She was stunned to read about a priest from Munich who had recorded SS confessions and passed them to the Allies, an operation so audacious she initially thought it must be Gestapo propaganda or misinformation. But as she cross-referenced the Soviet documents with newly declassified British files and interviewed surviving members of Munich's wartime intelligence community, she realized the story was true. She spent 6 years researching Weber's life, tracking down every available document, interviewing anyone who had known him or known of him, piecing together the fragments of a story that powerful institutions had worked hard to keep hidden. Claudia Brenner's book, titled The Confessor, A Priest's War Against the Third Reich, was published in 1998 in German and translated into English 2 years later. It caused an immediate sensation, sparking debates about the limits of religious confidentiality, the nature of moral courage, and the untold stories of resistance during the Holocaust. The Catholic Church's response was carefully calibrated and deeply conflicted. Official statements acknowledged Weber's courage, while emphasizing that the Church could not endorse the violation of the confessional seal under any circumstances, that sacred vows existed for profound reasons and could not be set aside even in the face of great evil. Unofficially, many priests and theologians expressed admiration for Weber, arguing that his actions represented the highest form of moral courage, choosing the greater good over adherence to rules that, in the extreme circumstances of the Holocaust, had become tools enabling evil. The debate raged in theological journals and seminary classrooms, with no clear consensus emerging. What was clear was that Weber's story forced the Church to confront uncomfortable questions about the role of religious institutions during the Nazi era, about the sins of silence and complicity, about what was owed to victims versus what was owed to sacramental integrity. The survivors and descendants of those who had been saved by Weber's intelligence provided the most powerful testimony. Through painstaking research, historians were able to identify at least 147 people who had escaped arrest or deportation because of warnings that traced back to Weber's recordings. These were not abstract numbers but real people. Ruth Steinberg, who was 9 years old when her family was warned to flee their Munich hiding place 2 hours before the Gestapo arrived, and who went on to become a prominent physician in Israel. Joseph Kramer, a resistance fighter who avoided capture because Allied intelligence warned his network about an SS operation targeting them, and who survived to testify at the Nuremberg trials. Maria Hoffmann, whose family of 5 was evacuated from Munich in March 1944, based on intelligence about Action Reinhard final phase, and whose descendants now numbered over 30 people spread across 3 continents. Each of these people owed their lives directly or indirectly to a priest they had never met, who had broken his most sacred vow because he believed that saving lives mattered more than preserving his own soul. They spoke at conferences, wrote testimonials, created memorial websites ensuring that Heinrich Weber's name would not be forgotten again, that his sacrifice would be remembered not as a footnote, but as a testament to the power of individual moral courage in the darkest of times. In 2004, 60 years after Father Weber's execution, the Catholic Church made a decision that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. After years of internal debate and pressure from both historians and Holocaust survivors, the Diocese of Munich and Freising announced that Father Heinrich Weber would be considered for beatification, the first step toward sainthood. This was extraordinary, not because of what Weber had done, but because of how he had done it, violating a sacrament that the Church had protected for over 1,000 years. The announcement sparked immediate controversy within the Church hierarchy, with conservative theologians arguing that canonizing a priest who broke the seal of confession would undermine the entire sacramental system and discourage penitents from seeking absolution. Progressive voices countered that Weber's actions represented a higher form of moral reasoning, that he had chosen the commandment against murder over ecclesiastical law, and that his willingness to accept damnation to save lives was the very definition of Christian sacrifice. The Vatican ultimately decided to proceed with a formal investigation, not to settle the theological debate, but to examine whether Weber's life and death met the criteria for heroic virtue, regardless of the controversial nature of his resistance. The investigation would take 8 years, involving testimony from dozens of witnesses, analysis of historical documents, and intensive theological debate about whether violating one sacred duty in service of another could be considered virtuous. The beatification investigation uncovered details about Weber's life that painted a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of a heroic priest. Investigators discovered that Weber had struggled with his decision for months before beginning his intelligence operation, that he had consulted with other priests who had unanimously advised him against it, warning that he would be breaking an absolute moral law that admitted no exceptions. They found his personal journals, which had been preserved by Father Otto Brenner and donated to the diocesan archives after Brenner's death in 1971. These journals revealed a man tormented by doubt, writing pages of theological arguments both for and against his planned course of action, questioning whether he was being called by God or tempted by pride disguised as righteousness. One entry from August 1943, just weeks before he began recording confessions, was particularly revealing. Weber wrote that he had prayed for a sign from God, some clear indication of whether his plan was divinely inspired or spiritually bankrupt, and that no sign had come. In the absence of divine guidance, he wrote, he would have to make his choice based on the limited light of human conscience, accepting that he might be wrong and willing to face eternal judgment for that error. This was not the certainty of a saint, but the anguish of a man who understood he was stepping into moral territory where no map existed. The investigation also revealed the cost that Weber's operation had exacted on others, a darker side of the story that complicated the narrative of heroic sacrifice. 23 members of St. Mary's Parish had been arrested in the Gestapo sweep following Weber's capture, accused of aiding and abetting his espionage activities. Most had been completely innocent, unaware of what their priest was doing, but guilt or innocence mattered little to the Gestapo. Of those 23, 7 were executed, 9 were sent to concentration camps, where 4 died before liberation, and the rest were imprisoned for periods ranging from 6 months to 3 years. Their families were marked as relatives of traitors, losing jobs and housing, subjected to surveillance and harassment that continued even after the war ended. The beatification investigators interviewed descendants of these people, and the responses were divided. Some expressed pride that their ancestors had been associated, however unwittingly, with resistance to the Nazis, and supported Weber's canonization as recognition of all who had suffered opposing the Reich. Others were bitter, arguing that Weber had brought destruction upon innocent people through his reckless actions, that a true priest would have found another way to resist that did not endanger his flock. One woman, granddaughter of a parishioner who died in Dachau, spoke passionately against beatification, saying that saints should protect their people, not sacrifice them for abstract principles. The theological heart of the beatification debate centered on a single question. Could violating the seal of confession ever be justified? And if so, did that justify the act, or did it simply make the sin necessary? The Church's traditional position was absolute. The seal of confession admitted no exceptions under any circumstances, not to prevent murder, not to save lives, not even to prevent genocide. A priest who revealed what was said in confession committed a mortal sin and was automatically excommunicated. But Weber's case presented a challenge to this absolutism because he had not revealed confessions to satisfy curiosity or for personal gain, but to stop ongoing atrocities and save innocent lives. Theologians began exploring concepts of moral conflict, situations where multiple absolute duties collide and any choice results in sin. Some argued that Weber had chosen the lesser sin, that breaking confession to save lives was morally superior to maintaining silence while knowing thousands would die. Others countered that this reasoning was dangerous, that if one absolute could be violated for good reasons, then all absolutes became negotiable, and the entire moral framework of Christianity would collapse into situation ethics. The debate revealed deep fault lines within Catholic theology about the nature of moral law, the role of conscience, and whether good intentions could transform objectively sinful acts into subjectively virtuous ones. In 2012, the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of Saints issued its decision. Father Heinrich Weber would not be beatified, but neither would his case be entirely rejected. Instead, the Church created a new category specifically for him and others like him: recognition as a witness to conscience, acknowledging his moral courage and the lives saved through his actions, while maintaining that his methods violated church law and could not be officially endorsed. This compromise satisfied almost no one. Supporters felt the Church had taken the cowardly path, unwilling to fully embrace a man who had embodied sacrificial love in its purest form. Critics felt the Church had gone too far, creating a dangerous precedent that weakened the absolute nature of the confessional seal. But the decision did accomplish one important thing. It ensured that Heinrich Weber's story would remain part of Catholic teaching, studied in seminaries and theological schools, not as a model to emulate, but as a case study in the agonizing complexity of moral choice under extreme circumstances. Students would debate his actions, argue about whether he was a saint or a sinner, And in that ongoing debate, his witness would continue, forcing each new generation to confront the question he had faced. What do you do when all your choices are sins, and silence itself becomes complicity in evil? The physical evidence of Father Weber's operation remained scattered and fragmented across multiple countries, preserved in archives that most people would never access. The recording device he had used, a modified wire recorder built by British intelligence engineers, was never recovered. It presumably was destroyed in the fire that consumed St. Mary's Church, or was seized by the Gestapo and melted down for metal during the desperate final months of the war, when Germany was stripping every resource to feed its collapsing military machine. The wire spools themselves met different fates. Two were held in classified British intelligence archives until their declassification in the 1990s, when they were transferred to the Imperial War Museum in London, where they remain today, available to researchers by appointment, but too fragile to be played on modern equipment. The third spool, the one that had escaped Gestapo capture and made its way to Allied intelligence through the chaos of the Munich black market, disappeared entirely from the historical record after 1945. Rumors persisted that it had been kept by an American intelligence officer as a personal souvenir, or that it had been destroyed to protect sources and methods, or that it sat forgotten in some warehouse alongside the Ark of the Covenant and other artifacts of lost history. The actual recordings were transcribed during the war, and those transcriptions survived, typed documents in English translation that captured the cold, bureaucratic language of SS officers confessing to mass murder as though they were reporting production numbers from a factory. In 2007, a German filmmaker named Markus Hoffmann, no relation to the post-war priest who had rebuilt St. Mary's Church, obtained permission to create a documentary about Father Weber's story. Hoffmann spent 3 years on the project, filming interviews with survivors, historians, theologians, and intelligence experts, traveling to Munich to film the rebuilt St. Mary's Church and to Stadelheim prison, where the execution site had been preserved as part of a memorial to Nazi victims. The most powerful sequence in the documentary featured actress recordings of the translated confessions, with a voice actor reading the words that Colonel Richter and other SS officers had spoken in the confessional booth. Hearing these confessions in audio form, even recreated, created a visceral impact that written transcripts could not match. The casual tone, the lack of remorse, the treatment of mass murder as an administrative challenge rather than a moral horror. The documentary, titled The Weight of Silence, premiered at the Berlin Film Festival in 2010 and won several awards for historical filmmaking. More importantly, it introduced Weber's story to millions of people who had never heard of him, sparking renewed interest in the forgotten heroes of the resistance and the moral complexities of opposition to totalitarianism. The documentary also renewed debate about whether Weber had been right to do what he did, with viewers across the political and religious spectrum expressing passionate and conflicting opinions. Online forums filled with arguments about the seal of confession, the nature of absolute moral rules, and whether any cause justified violating sacred oaths. Some viewers saw Weber as a clear hero, a man who had the courage to act when others remained silent, who understood that rules designed for normal times became tools of evil in extraordinary circumstances. Others saw him as tragically misguided, a priest who had abandoned his calling in favor of playing spy, whose actions had brought suffering to innocent people while yielding intelligence of questionable value. Theologians appeared on talk shows to debate the case. Philosophers wrote opinion pieces analyzing the ethics of his choice, and the documentary became required viewing in ethics courses at universities around the world. What made the debate so intense was that Weber's case resisted simple categorization. He was neither purely heroic nor purely tragic, neither saint nor sinner, but something more complicated and human, a man who had made an impossible choice and paid the ultimate price without ever knowing if he had chosen correctly. The Jewish community's response to Weber's story was particularly significant and added another layer of complexity to his legacy. Many Holocaust survivors and their descendants expressed deep gratitude for Weber's actions, arguing that any person who had saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust deserved recognition regardless of the methods employed. Organizations like Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims and heroes, considered whether Weber should be recognized as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Nazi era. The deliberations were complicated by the fact that Weber had not directly saved people through hiding or smuggling, as most recipients had, but through intelligence gathering that indirectly prevented arrests and deportations. Additionally, Weber's motivations had been broader than specifically protecting Jews. He had been opposing Nazi atrocities generally, though Jews were the primary victims of those atrocities. After years of consideration, Yad Vashem decided to include Weber in their archives and educational materials, but not to grant him the formal title, a decision that reflected the unique nature of his resistance. However, several survivors who owed their lives to warnings derived from Weber's intelligence traveled to Munich to attend memorial services in his honor, and their testimony about what his sacrifice had meant to them provided the most compelling argument for remembering him not as a theological puzzle, but as a human being who had chosen love over law. St. Mary's Church in Munich became an unlikely pilgrimage site after the documentary's release, with visitors from around the world coming to see the place where Father Weber had conducted his secret war against the SS. The current priest, Father Michael Stein, installed a small memorial plaque in 2011, placed near where the original confessional booth had stood before the fire. The plaque's text was carefully worded after consultation with the diocese. In memory of Father Heinrich Weber, 1903 to 1944, priest of this parish, who gave his life opposing evil. His story reminds us that faith sometimes demands impossible choices and that God's mercy is greater than our understanding. The plaque sparked its own minor controversy, with some parishioners feeling it was inappropriate to memorialize a priest who had violated the seal of confession, while others felt it did not go far enough in celebrating his heroism. Father Stein navigated these tensions by emphasizing that the memorial was not endorsing Weber's methods, but honoring his courage and acknowledging that his story belonged to the parish's history. The church began offering tours that included Weber's story, presented honestly with all its moral complexity, and the confessional booth became a place where visitors would pause in reflection, some praying for Weber's soul, others simply contemplating what they would have done in his position, a question that had no comfortable answer, then or now. So what do we do with the story of Father Heinrich Weber? How do we hold in our minds a man who was simultaneously a betrayer of sacred vows and a savior of innocent lives, who damned himself according to the laws of his own church while embodying the very essence of Christian sacrifice? This is not a comfortable story with clear heroes and villains, not a tale that ends with easy moral lessons or reassuring certainties. Weber's story forces us to confront something we desperately want to avoid. The reality that sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible ones, and that the people we call heroes are often those who chose to bear the weight of necessary sins rather than preserve their own purity through inaction. Think about that for a moment. Weber could have remained silent, could have maintained the seal of confession, could have kept his soul clean according to church law, while thousands died with secrets locked safely in his heart. He would have been blameless by the standards of his profession, righteous in the eyes of ecclesiastical authority, and utterly complicit in genocide. Instead, he chose what he believed was the greater good, knowing it would cost him everything: his reputation, his freedom, his life, and possibly his eternal soul. What kind of courage does that require? What kind of faith allows a man to risk damnation to save strangers he will never meet? The truth that makes Weber's story so powerful and so disturbing is that we cannot know with certainty whether he made the right choice. The Church says he sinned gravely by breaking the seal of confession, and by the objective standards of Catholic moral theology, that judgment is correct. The confessional seal exists for profound reasons: to create a space where even the worst sinners can seek redemption without fear, to protect the vulnerable from exposure, to maintain the sacred boundary between human judgment and divine mercy. When Weber violated that seal, he damaged something precious and irreplaceable, setting a precedent that could be abused by less scrupulous people for less noble purposes. But he also saved lives, real breathing human beings who went on to have children and grandchildren, who contributed to the world in ways large and small, who existed because a middle-aged priest in Munich decided that preventing murder mattered more than preserving his own righteousness. How do we weigh those lives against the principle he violated? Can we weigh them? Should we even try? These are not rhetorical questions, but genuine moral dilemmas that resist easy answers, and anyone who tells you they know with certainty whether Weber was right or wrong is lying to you or to themselves. What we can say with certainty is that Father Heinrich Weber represents something essential about human moral capacity, the ability to act in the absence of certainty, to make choices when all options carry terrible costs, to accept responsibility for the consequences of our actions, even when we cannot predict or control those consequences. This is what separates moral courage from mere rule-following. It is easy to be good when the path is clear, when duty and desire align, when doing the right thing costs nothing. It is infinitely harder to be good when every choice is a compromise, when the rules we trust provide no guidance, when acting on conscience means accepting condemnation from the very authorities we have been trained to respect. Weber did not have the luxury of moral clarity. He faced a situation where silence was complicity and speech was betrayal, where maintaining his sacred vows meant enabling atrocities and breaking those vows meant destroying the foundations of his spiritual identity. He made his choice, and he paid for it, and he did so without ever knowing whether God or history would vindicate him. That uncertainty, that willingness to act despite not knowing if you are right, is perhaps the truest test of moral character. The question Weber's story asks of us is simple and terrible. What would you have done? And before you answer too quickly, before you confidently assert that you would have done the same thing, or that you would have found some third option that avoided the dilemma entirely, sit with the reality of what that choice actually meant. Imagine yourself as that 47-year-old priest, listening to a man casually describe the murder of 342 children, a man who shows no remorse and will return next week to confess more atrocities, knowing that your silence protects him and damns his victims. Imagine knowing that hidden in your cassock is a device that could record his words, that could provide intelligence to stop future operations, that could save lives you will never see or know. Imagine also knowing that using that device means breaking a vow you made to God, violating a sacrament you have honored for 20 years, possibly condemning your immortal soul to hell for all eternity. What do you choose? And more importantly, how do you live with whatever you choose? Because that is the reality Weber faced, not in abstract philosophical debate, but in the crushing immediacy of that wooden booth where sins were spoken and souls were weighed. He chose action over purity, consequence over principle, and he accepted the cost. Can you say with absolute certainty that you would have had that courage? Here is what I believe Father Heinrich Weber would want us to take from his story. Not that he was right, or that his methods should be emulated, but that silence in the face of evil is itself a choice, and often the worst choice available. We live in a time when people increasingly retreat behind institutional rules and professional obligations to avoid moral responsibility, when "I was just following orders" or "it's not my job" become acceptable excuses for enabling harm. Weber's story reminds us that sometimes following the rules makes you complicit, that sometimes your duty to humanity supersedes your duty to institutions, and that sometimes the price of keeping your hands clean is paid in other people's blood. His story is not comfortable, and it should not be. It should disturb us, challenge us, force us to examine our own moral certainties, and ask whether we would have the courage to act when action demands sacrifice. Whether Father Heinrich Weber is in heaven or hell, I cannot say, and neither can anyone else. But I know this: he deserves to be remembered not as a footnote or a curiosity, but as a testament to the agonizing complexity of moral choice under impossible circumstances. He deserves to be remembered because his story is not really about the past. It is about the eternal human struggle to be good in a world that makes goodness difficult, to act with courage when fear counsels silence, and to accept the cost of conscience even when that cost is everything we hold dear. That struggle did not end in 1944, and it will not end with us. So remember Father Heinrich Weber. Remember what he did and what it cost him, and when you face your own impossible choices, Remember that you are not alone in the darkness, that others have walked this path before you, and that sometimes the truest measure of faith is the willingness to risk everything, even your soul, for love.